All right, I can think of nobody better to help us break down what happened over the weekend in Israel as Iran fired over 300 Iranian missiles and drones. I was thinking about this guy over the weekend, just like all of the stuff that he covers with the Pentagon, with the Department of Defense. Nobody better to help us break it all down. Idrees Ali, our buddy. Idrees, Mike, and Nick, thanks for having back on the podcast with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You know, I want to get like a 30,000 foot overview because maybe some folks were not tuned in to the breaking news coverage that happened on Saturday night. We're recording this on a Sunday night. If you're listening to this on a Monday or Tuesday, thank you. So there was a bunch that happened over the weekend. There's been analysis from different folks that worked in the former administration, some folks that, you know, have worked in the defense departments and stuff like that. But can you kind of explain at a high level just kind of what happened Saturday in retrospect with respect to Iran sending these missiles and drones to Israel and their defense system kind of shooting these down?
Yeah. So basically, over the past week and a half, 2 weeks, since Israel targeted senior Iranian leadership in Damascus, the question has been how will Israel respond? Or how will Iran respond, and how will Israel defend against it? And so, for the past couple of days, we've been seeing this sort of steady drumbeat from our sources and others saying Iran's going to attack. They're moving drones, they're moving missiles within the country, and they're getting ready to attack. And so, finally, on Saturday, sort of around midday, 3-ish p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so sort of later in the day in the region, Iran launches the first wave, which is sort of hundreds of drones in the direction of Israel. Those are pretty slow moving. They take hours and hours and hours to reach Israel. And what we started seeing is, you know, they're pretty visible, they're pretty slow moving. People could see them over the skies of Iraq. And we started seeing countries like the United States, the UK, armed forces, and the French, and the Israelis start bringing them down. That was followed by some cruise missiles, which are, you know, a lot faster. They fly a bit lower. And those were the second wave. And then we saw the third wave, which were the ballistic missiles, which, you know, can reach Israel from Iran within like 12 to 15 minutes as sort of the third wave. So essentially, we had three waves of attack, each getting progressively more serious. At the end of it, Israel and sort of the United States and other countries were able to shoot at about 99% of those. And at the end of the day, we basically had a situation where, for the first time, Iran had attacked Israel from its own territory in response to it being attacked. But there wasn't really much damage. And so sort of this worst case scenario about, you know, it could be horrifically catastrophic, people could die, didn't come true. I think there's a debate about why that was. Was it because Iran warned people ahead of time, or was it because the defenses were so good? Either way, it's a situation which, you know, if you ask me Friday night, what's sort of the best case scenario, this would be pretty close to it because, you know, frankly, no one died. And it gives Israel sort of a less of a reason to retaliate in sort of a strong manner.
Just knowing what we know about Israel's defense system, was the recent missile strike essentially performative at best? Did Iran think that they could actually make any type of headway in terms of any show of force through this attack?
That's a good question, because I think it is a debate about what the intention was. You know, the drones itself, they're just really slow. And if it was just the drones and just cruise missiles, which are, you know, faster, but still pretty easy to shoot down, I think the answer would be they were just making a show of it. The ballistic missiles is where I think, you know, these are like really fast, really sort of low flying missiles that gave people pause. I mean, there were, you know, over 100 fired towards Israel, and you just need to get one or two through. So I think, you know, we heard a U.S. official say, look, the intention was for them to kill, and it's really Israel's sort of layered defense where they have fighter aircraft, they have, you know, these Arrow 1, Arrow 2 air defense systems. They've invested a lot in making sure that, you know, they can shoot things down. And so, you know, I think at this point in time, it seems like Iran, you know, maybe measured their response, but it wasn't so limited that there was going to be no casualties. There was a real chance if one or two got through, hit the wrong places or the right places, it could cause a lot of damage.
Idrees, let's get into the why they sent this in the first place. And I referenced it kind of at the beginning. You wrote an article a few weeks back with one of your colleagues about, you know, the attack on the Iranian consulate over in Damascus in Syria. And you were mentioning, well, first off, why don't you take us inside Your reporting on that, what happened back on April 1st in terms of the Iranian generals that were killed in this consulate, and why Iran actually fired these missiles and these drones at Israel in retaliation?
Yeah, look, I mean, for the past several years, there's sort of been this, I don't want to call it shadow war, because it's been Israel just firing missiles at Iranian and Iranian-backed groups in Syria. And so that's been going on pretty regularly. They would spot some Iranian missiles going towards the border or close to the border between Syria and Israel, and they would fire off a missile and destroy it, and they would hit targets near Damascus. What happened on sort of April 1st in Damascus was pretty different. They being Israel, struck what many people, including the Iranians, say was a diplomatic facility um, in or next to the Iranian embassy in Damascus, and they took out 7 Iranian generals, including the most senior person who has been killed since Qasem Soleimani, who you remember was killed in a U.S. drone strike a couple of years ago. And so it was a really pretty brazen attack because, for one thing, they didn't tell the United States before it happened. And so they went alone. They took the strike, broke diplomatic protocol. People would argue it's probably legally questionable, probably illegal, actually, if you ask some folks. And it was a really brazen attack because it wasn't just against Iranian generals. It was against Iranian generals in another country, in a diplomatic facility. And so the guy who was killed, he was a senior general in the IRGC, one of the most senior ones, and really a significant player in the operations that Iran was carrying out in Iraq, in Syria. And it put pressure on the Iranian government, the Ayatollah, to sort of respond because, there is this image that they try to portray that it is security first, they will stand up to Israel. So they had been punched in the mouth, and really it was a question not of when Iran would respond, it was how Iran would respond, and it just sort of, culminated in what we saw on Saturday afternoon.
Quick break from the pod. As always, we are presented by our friends over at SeatGeek. If you need tickets to the biggest concerts, shows, sporting events, MLB season that's starting up this coming week, you got the NBA and NHL playoffs coming up soon. SeatGeek has got you covered. Nick, did you download the SeatGeek app like I told you?
Did. We're excited to use it because we've got obviously the Phillies starting up this season. So I'm excited to take my girls out there and just take full advantage of the perks we get as partners.
That's right, as you should, as should our audience right now. So if you're watching or listening to this, when you download the app, you put the tickets in the cart. When you hit the checkout, there's going to be a little promo code field right there. Do me a favor, enter in the promo code, Can We Please Talk, all one word. You're going to get $20 off that purchase. Download the SeatGeek app or go to SeatGeek.com to get your tickets today.
So there's some worries from the Pentagon about a growing alliance that may be potentially forming, or maybe it's always been there, with regards to, because what we understand is that, essentially in Damascus, you have this attack and then there's retaliation, but there seems to be a relationship between Syria and Iran. And now obviously, we have what's going on between Iran and Israel. Should this situation continue to get worse, is there the potential of other nations within that territory that potentially may choose to take sides?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, there was an interesting concern leading up to Saturday. It wasn't just what Iran would launch, it's what its proxies or the groups it's backed in the region would do. So Hezbollah in Lebanon, right? You have the PMF, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq and Syria, what they would do, and the Houthis in Yemen, what they would do. We saw some missiles coming from Yemen, some potentially from Iraq and Syria, but not in the same way that there was concern. So that was a huge concern for the Pentagon, what these regional proxy groups would do. And so that's still a concern. It didn't sort of bear out in the same way. What we actually saw, which I thought was quite interesting, was some of the countries that sort of came to the defense of Israel, which you might not think. So Jordan itself, which borders Israel, ended up shooting down some projectiles. It was a pretty interesting thing because Iran came out and said, warned Jordan not to do that. And so we're seeing this interesting dynamic where, countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, who, traditionally might not be, well, Egypt is, but Saudi Arabia traditionally not the closest in terms of relations with Israel, not really coming out and supporting Iran, actually calling them out. And so we're seeing this interesting situation where a lot of countries calling Iran out, partially because they don't agree with it, and partially because they're really concerned about the spiraling. The concern is, okay, Iran's attacked, Now, Israel would retaliate. Does that force the Iranians to retaliate? And you could see a situation where this could spin out of control really, really fast. And so I think for the Pentagon and for the Biden administration, the concern is keeping this to a minimal level, not letting other countries get involved, keeping these regional proxies to a minimum. And really, it's the aim is not, some, honestly, like there was talk about this mega deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel. I think the concern now is like, how do we keep this region, together rather than some sort of massive progress?
Idrees, get ready to kind of laugh, but also give us a moment of literacy. You're going to know what I mean in just a second, because scrolling Twitter, obviously we follow each other on social media. X, I refuse to call it X. I'm going to call it Twitter. But you were posting some great stuff about, Iran's retaliation this past weekend. And as I was checking this morning, watching the Sunday shows and scrolling through Twitter, I couldn't help but notice a tweet about the Iran nuclear deal that the Biden administration renegotiated. I want you to explain that deal first, but take a listen to who it was from. It was from Auburn men's basketball coach Bruce Pearl. That's right. You heard me right. He said on Twitter, because President Biden chose to renegotiate the Iran nuclear deal and remove sanctions on Iran, he enriched these terrorists, their proxies, and destabilized the entire Middle East. Idrees, I don't want you to break down Auburn's loss to Yale in the NCAA tournament. I do want you to break down what he just said there and the Iran nuclear deal. Is this because of that? Explain what the Auburn men's basketball coach is talking about there.
Yeah, I had not seen that. I'm actually going to go out right after this and see that tweet. Look, the Iran nuclear deal is a polarizing issue, right? Ever since it was negotiated by the Obama administration, which essentially put restrictions on what Iran could do for a certain period of time, in return for sanctions relief, funds that were Iranian funds, giving them back to Iran. It's been polarizing. The Trump administration tore it up, and the complaint, like you sort of mentioned, has been, oh, because of this Iran nuclear deal, Iran is now in a position to grow, to have its nuclear weapons, to have cash it can then use to fund its activities. The counter to that, and I think most sort of objective experts would agree, is that the Iran nuclear deal was not meant as some sort of ability to cap Iranian sort of non-nuclear capabilities. It was to cap Iran's nuclear capabilities for a certain period of time, which it did. And it probably would have done even more if it hadn't been torn up by the Trump administration. The aim was never to say, okay, this is now going to mean that Iran will never do anything bad. It was very much a very specific thing that they were trying to control, which is, the desire to get nuclear weapons, which is the worst case scenario for I think most people. And so I think there's some misperception about what it was, what it would have done. The Obama administration officials and probably Biden administration officials would argue that if anything, it gave them other avenues to spend money on. It brought them, sort of more into the fold, making them less reliant and less sort of, likely to fund some of the proxy groups, invest less in sort of its military industrial complex. And so it's one of those things where, I think if you look back, this probably would have happened regardless of the Iran nuclear deal. And it probably, frankly, would have been potentially even worse if that wasn't the case.
Just bring us back to Gaza for a moment. What's been the assessment of the Pentagon with recently with just what we've seen with the ongoings from the IDF? And I ask this primarily because right now we're obviously in a place of a little more sympathy that other nations of the world may be lending towards Israel, despite criticism of the IDF's handling of the hostage situation with their attacks, obviously, in Gaza. What's been the Pentagon's most recent views and concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I think, someone I was talking to said, the biggest loser yesterday was Gaza, not only because, it sort of gives sympathy back to Israel, but because, there's been a lot of focus on Gaza and for a night at least, and I think that might continue for the next few days, that focuses away from Gaza completely. There are not many stories that are happening at the same level on Gaza that probably is needed. I think there's been a lot of frustration within the Pentagon about the way the Israelis have been handling their military operations. The strike on the World Central Kitchen was really, I think, just sort of the tip of the iceberg. It showed down a complete breakdown in communication. There are questions about the rules of engagement, questions about how the Israeli military, Israeli Air Force sees people in Palestine and the Palestinians. Do they see them as civilians? Do they see anyone who's, male fighting age, a sort of fair target? And so there's been a lot of concern. We saw pretty early on in the conflict, the Pentagon send senior officials who, learned lessons from America's failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, go to Israel and say, look, this is what we've learned. Do not make this mistake again. You cannot bomb your way out of this conflict. You cannot bomb an ideology away. And I think, publicly, Pentagon officials say, oh, like it's having an effect. Israel's not doing some of the things. But as a whole, I think there's pretty high levels of concern about sort of the indiscriminate nature of some of the strikes that Israel is doing. And, I think there was a decent amount of momentum to rein some of that in after the World Food Kitchen strike. But there was a debate about, does the U.S. and the Biden administration start conditioning aid to Israel? I think that debate is probably gone now, at least for a bit after the Iranian attack. Right, it sort of changes the narrative completely. And I think in the background, the Pentagon and the administration is going to continue telling the Israelis, like, hey, civilian casualties, you have to do a better job. Let's see if that works.
Let's see if that works. You summed it up perfectly right there. We'll be following it. And you can follow him on social media. Check out all of his articles over on Reuters.com or download the Reuters app. That's how I stay informed on all of this stuff. Sometimes I just text him as well. Idrees Ali, fantastic correspondent over at Reuters. Thanks for all you do. Continued success to you, buddy. Stay safe.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it. And we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.